Hello, everybody. Welcome or welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the dark and winding roads that lead around the Delmarva Peninsula. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a returning listener, welcome back. Just a couple of things before I get started today on the story or case that we're going to cover. First is I do want to get this episode out before the end of Valentine's Day weekend. So if you do happen to hear a lot of noise outside, it's because it is extremely windy. So far, there have been two instances where things have fallen onto the house. One was a relatively small branch that went down one side of the house. The other, though, was, I guess technically it's a branch because it came off a tree, but it's wide enough and big enough that it could have been considered, a good portion of the tree. Fell against the roof, and the kids thought it was thunder, but no, it's this pretty big branch, if you will. So if I hear that happen again, I'll pause, but I want to try to get this out. So please ignore any of the wind that's going on in the background. And some parts of the area have lost some electricity pretty close by. So hopefully we'll get that done before that happens. But also, I do want to go over just some things that have been happening that may or may not affect the future of the channel. Mainly is over about the past month and a half, I have been dealing with identity theft. And that also includes something done through a government agency. And so that has made my life pretty much a living nightmare. I haven't been able to get any help. Basically, finally, I've reached out to all three of the representatives from Delaware, whether they are senators or House of Representatives. I didn't hear back from two of them, but thankfully a third has been trying to help me. Over the last couple of weeks, I haven't really gotten any help from the police, which it pains me to say, but one of the responses given was, "Don't hold your breath." But I've actually managed to track down a picture of the person where they've opened accounts in my name, even though one didn't show up through any of the monitoring apps, like credit monitoring apps. It didn't show up there, but I was able to track that down and also get a little upset at some places because this person doesn't even know how to spell my name, yet sign my name, spelling it incorrectly. They have since figured it out, by the way, so I'm not giving away anything to them in case they're listening. But yeah, they figured it out because eventually the signature did turn into the correct one. So, yeah, there have been days where I've just spent pretty much the whole day trying to track things down. But at this point, I did have to cancel the subscriptions that I use. So anything like the newspapers.com or similar services that I use to try to first locate stories, and then secondly to get contemporary reports from that specific time frame, that has been canceled at least for the foreseeable future. And in, I believe it's April, is when the renewal for the podcast platform is renewed. So depending on whether or not things are still happening at that time, I may have to migrate to another another platform. I like the one that I'm using because it's very intuitive. It does a lot of things for those who are not, completely computer savvy, at least when it comes to audio video. So I may have to move the episodes, but if that happens, there may be, on the free ones, there may be a limit to how many episodes that it can handle or that it will take for free. So that also means for this episode, where I'd love to do two separate episodes, it's going to be in one, so it might be rather lengthy. If it does come to the point where I will need to migrate the episodes, I will, put up an episode where, I explain that. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it will all be taken care of by then, but I guess to repeat the local police, I'm not holding my breath that it will be. So I just wanted to go over all of that first. And because this episode I do anticipate being quite lengthy, I'm going to get into it pretty quickly. And especially as there are a couple side stories, how I go over the history of the area. There are a couple stories I want to talk about as well within the history. So I may be moving rather quickly. Some people may be pretty familiar with this case as well, as it's one of the stories that did make it to a lot of nationwide, not just news coverage, but also documentaries on certain court or law channels. So you may have heard of it. Something I was surprised about is how many people believe that the convicted person was not either given a fair trial or evidence was given more weight than it should have been. As after reviewing and I say quite a few articles on this, as well as what I remember when this all initially happened, this is one of those cases where the circumstantial evidence is so extremely abundant that I'm surprised that there are people out there who are adamantly backing the person who was convicted. And I do hope to hear back from you, say if you don't agree with that opinion that, I'm looking at in regards to this. There are a few points that are brought up by the supporters of the convicted murderer that I will point out and go over as to why it doesn't really hold water in terms of whether or not the verdict was accurate. And the story that we'll be discussing today took place in St. Michael's, Maryland in 2008, and it was the murder of Stephen Hricko, and is probably the most blatant case of the phrase, words have consequences. So I was hoping to get this out by Valentine's Day, but some things came up, unfortunately, and I wasn't able to get it out by then. But we're going to be first just looking a little bit out at St. Michael's, Maryland, which is a town that is on the eastern shore on Bayside, basically meaning it's on the side of the Chesapeake Bay and is a town that is just on the water. Now, many people look at Valentine's Day as a day to express their love for their significant other outside of days such as a birthday or anniversary or holiday. Others look at it as a time where manufacturers, stores, everyone got together to come up with a day to make more money in between Christmas and, let's just say, Easter as another holiday. So no matter how you look at it, though, it is a time where there are usually more events, more things that are focused towards couples. And Stephen and Kimberly Hricko decided to go to St. Michael's, Maryland on that Valentine's Day weekend to attend a murder mystery dinner theater. The cottages that they would be spending the night at or the weekend at were at a golf course named Harbor Town. And they had little cottages, which were more of cottage blocks, meaning it was a building that hosted 6 rooms, so that it wasn't as big as, say, a hotel, but it was not its own little standalone cottage. Their marriage had been, I guess you would say, suffering through some hardships at the time, and Stephen really did want to get things back on track to try to save the marriage that they'd had. They'd been married for about 10 years and had a daughter together, so he was looking at this as a time to work on rebuilding the marriage to where it had once been. Now, as of 2020, St. Michael's itself had about 1,050 residents and had a total square mileage of 1.27 square miles. As we've discussed in the past, any town that is built on the water usually has that as one of its first, if not its main, source of income and revenue. And this is something that the early settlers saw as their means of income. Besides using the town as a town to ship goods such as tobacco and moving goods along the waterways not only as an import area, but export. St. Michael's became a town that was known for shipbuilders. And at least before 1812, there were at least 6 known shipbuilders that were working in St. Michael's. The town was named after an Episcopal parish that had been built in town, and the parish itself was around 1677, and the church was named after the Archangel Michael, hence St. Michael's. It was in the 1770s when a man named James Braddock did look at the town and saw further opportunities and possibilities, using the water as a way to one of their main industries. In mentioning 1812, that was a key date in the War of 1812 itself to the town of St. Michael's. Now, St. Michael's became known as a place where the Baltimore Clipper ship was built. We've briefly touched on clipper ships before, but the Baltimore Clipper was fast, and that was important for a number of different reasons. One, just if you can move quickly, you can export more goods. Also, even though it was more inland, meaning it was in the bay, so between 2 different pieces of land, there were still pirates that would try to steal and plunder, and having a faster ship definitely was an advantage. And last, as we approached the War of 1812, being able to outrun the enemy was very strategic in and of itself. But Sir George Cockburn of the Royal Navy saw St. Michael's as an advantageous place to conquer. So St. Michael's did have some batteries to help defend the town against any enemies. And so Cockburn thought, this is a place that we can try to take a stronghold, and not only have access to shipbuilders and their supplies to build ships, repair ships, but also they have batteries along the waterways and in the main center of town. We can try to take a hold of them, and that will be an advantage as well. So it was on August 10th that he had some of his men approach St. Michael's, but just shy south of the town. They went and neutralized the main battery of St. Michael's and then made their way back to their ship. However, they underestimated the people of St. Michael's. Once it was apparent that they were under attack, there were 2 things that were done. First is many of the town went to man other batteries at Dawson's Wharf and at Mill Point, whereas they also turned off the lights in their homes. They then hung lanterns in trees so that when the British were firing upon the town, they were firing towards the trees that had the lanterns in them. Because of this, there was some damage to the houses in town, but it was minimal. So they really underestimated the ingenuity of townfolk of St. Michael's. Moving forward in time, as time passed, there were more industries that abounded that weren't so reliant on the waterways. The shipbuilding aspects of St. Michael's kind of waned some, but that did not mean they didn't work the water still, as many people still do in that area. Trolling, or at the time we could say tonging for oysters, was a big business. And here's where we come across one of the interesting stories of the town. Around 1902, 3 men, who one actually did drop off pretty early, decided to build a seafood packing company. So the 2 that remained were William Cockburn and Frederick Jewett, and they started the Cockburn and Jewett Seafood Packing Company. Now, this was remarkable for a few different reasons. First is the company became one of the largest employers in the area. They concentrated on, packing, shipping oysters and crabs as well. It became one of the largest employers in St. Michael's that there had been for probably about 60 years. And even at times of the year when other businesses may have been letting people go, or the number of workers they had diminished, Frederick Jewett and William Cockburn were still able to keep about 100 people employed year-round. Now, as I said, said this started around 1902, the company did, and they were able to get a loan from a bank to start building their company. And at that time, it was very difficult for a Black man or Black men to be able to get a loan and to be able to build a company. And Frederick Jewett especially was able to work with others and even have some of the white watermen sell to him in order to process, pack, and ship their goods. Because initially it was only Black watermen that would work with Frederick Jewett, but eventually the white watermen did see the advantages of working with him and how good he was at being a businessman. So especially at that time, it was extremely difficult for that to occur, and he was able to overcome all of that. Also, the way that people buy and sell crab meat would look completely different if not for one of Jewett's contributions that still lives on today. At the time, crabs were just basically sold as crabs. There was no grading of the meat, but he did look at the crabs and realize some meat would be worth more than others. So he did classify that into lump, claw, blackfin, special, and regular. Now, I prefer lump just, because of the name. You get more than you would get from, say, the claw. But that delineation or classification is still used today. St. Michael's also played a role in the life of another Frederick named Frederick Douglass. In my hometown, there is a school named after him, even though it's in Delaware, but his name still carries the legacy of what he accomplished. Now, in 1832, St. Michael's was a town, of course, like I've mentioned, on the water, and that is a town where Frederick Douglass was first sold into slavery. And that's hard to say that somebody could be bought, that somebody could be sold to another person. But Frederick Douglass did try to escape. He was held there at another time during an escape, but it was in 1838 that he did actually end up traveling through Delaware during his escape, dressed as a sailor. He did receive the sailor uniform from another woman, a free Black woman named Anna Murray. And then the papers that he used to travel was from a free Black man who gave him his papers. And that was in itself very courageous for someone to give up the papers that said, during a time where slavery had not been abolished yet, to give another person their papers to be able to move freely about the areas. Now, Douglass eventually traveled through other areas of the world, including Ireland, Scotland, and England. And in his writings, we can see the empathy that he had for others, even though he'd been through so much himself. He arrived in Ireland about the time of the potato famine and saw the struggles and poverty that most of the families were living in at that time. And in his writings, you can see the sympathy and empathy that he had towards those going through the famine. But his words and his convictions were so strong that after leaving Britain, he had the equivalent of $56,000 that had been given to him to help him in his endeavors and to try to bring about the abolition of slavery. Additionally, he also fought for women's rights. In 1876, he gave the speech to unveil the Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park, Washington. And in a historical presidential ticket, he became the first Black man to be nominated as vice presidential candidate for his party. The presidential candidate was Victoria Woodhull, who fought for women's rights, and the party that they ran for was the Equal Rights Party. Now, Victoria Woodhull, though not having the connections to Delmarva, was still very interesting of herself. So I will leave links to information on Frederick Douglass, Victoria, and the town of St. Michael's as well. Now, even though Douglass was not elected to be Vice President of the United States, he did still hold a number of different positions throughout his lifetime, such as a United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, becoming the first African American to be appointed to that post. He also served as the United States Minister Resident to Haiti. Um, and again, just a lot of things that he did that were immeasurable, that his legacy still lives on. And, every day we see that in my hometown with one of the schools being named after him. And also, just something I found very heartwarming was he and Anna Murray, the woman who gave him the sailor's uniform, did get married. So when I first saw her name in reading this, I was hoping that they would. And they did. They, however, did have to use a different last name for a while, since he was considered escaped. And so that way they would be able to keep under the radar some. But they did get married and spend a lifetime together. Getting back to more recent times, while the industry of St. Michael's has changed some, in around the 1970s, it did become more of a tourist location. That was because in the middle of the 1960s, 1965, a maritime museum was opened, and that started to bring some people to the area. And then it just grew from there, with more tourists coming. That meant more restaurants and hotels or places for people to stay were built. And, it just kind of built upon each other. In 2007, it was named number 8 in the top 10 romantic escapes in the USA. And it was also named as being the most romantic place to escape to. However, I kind of wonder if Stephen Hricko would have thought that. So now we're on to the main characters in today's case. Now, Kimberly Hricko was a surgical technician and had been married to Stephen Hricko. Stephen was a golf course maintenance professional, and at the time of today's events that we'll be going over, they had decided to stay at the Harbortown Golf Course in Cottage Building number 5. At around 1:20 a.m. on February 15th, Kimberly entered the lobby to the Harbortown Golf Course. Inside the lobby were Elaine Phillips, who was the night manager of Harbortown, as well as actually some of her family, one being her cousin Philip Parker. He would be of the most note to what's going to be happening over the next few moments. According to the cousins, Kimberly calmly walked up to them and asked for someone who worked there. Elaine asked how she could help, and it was described that Kimberly was pretty calm as she said, "My room is on fire." Now, in their testimony, they did see it as strange that she was so calm, but I do try to be more open-minded about that, as some people, do tend to stay more calm during tragedies or times that can be kind of chaotic. That's how I normally approach things, is I'm pretty calm as it's happening, because I look at it as, okay, someone has to stay calm. And frankly, my husband is the one who's usually a little more frantic. So someone has to stay calm, but then afterwards, after everything is finished, they usually have a little bit of a cry or breakdown, depending on how intense the emotions are. I usually end up crying afterwards if there's something going on that, I might stay calm during the actual events, but then when it's all said and done, I usually do anything from cry to just kind of break down a little bit, because things can be very stressful. So I'm trying to give Kimberly the benefit of the doubt in that she was very calm when she said this. However, she also could not remember her room number, so Elaine did have to run over and look at the register and find out where they were while they were calling 911. Now, Kimberly did say she had called 911, and Elaine did see her when she walked in having her telephone on, but she had it upside down, so it was like she was talking into the listening end. And finally, when they asked if anybody was in the room, Kimberly said she thought that her husband may have been in the room. And that brings the situation to a whole new level, because even though the room was on fire, and yes, there were 5 other cottages or 5 other rooms in that cottage block, if it was just that room, that meant that there was a man in there who could be unconscious or hurt, not able to get out. So the cousins made their way to room 506 and found that the front door was locked. Remembering that there was a sliding glass door on the side, they ran over to that, and Philip could see that there were some feet and legs sticking out from between two twin beds. So Philip did get in there, and between him and his cousin, they were able to drag him out to the porch. But it was obvious that it was too late. Now, this part can be a little disturbing to visualize, but they were able to see that most of his torso and downward were untouched. They were fine, but from about the mid-chest upward was burned and unrecognizable. So again, it was very obvious that it was too late, that he had passed away. As first responders arrived, including police officers, there was a thought that many of them began to have. This was Valentine's Day weekend. Why wasn't Kimberly in the room at a little after 1 a.m. with her husband? To find out more what happened, we have to go back a little bit and look at the relationship between Kimberly and Stephen and how they just got to the situation we're talking about today. Initially, by all outward appearances, they were your average middle-class couple living the average middle-class life. They had met through some mutual friends. Stephen had been a longtime friend of a man named Michael Miller, who they had met when they were still around the 7th grade or middle school. Now, as time went by and they went off to college, Mike fell in love with a woman named Maureen, and I don't have her maiden name, so she will just be referred to as Maureen or Maureen Miller throughout the story. When these two were in college at Penn State, Maureen had met Kimberly, and together, between their mutual friends, they actually went out on a double date, and Maureen would later say that we went out on a double date one evening and Steve fell in love with Kimberly immediately. So it was in 1989 that the couple married, and within the year they had a daughter. I'm not going to say the daughter's name first name just because she has been through so much. I'm sure that she sees this in, different publications or on TV. So I'm just going to afford her a little bit of privacy by not saying her first name. Now, eventually, both Mike and Stephen worked in the same field, literally and kind of literally and figuratively, as they both managed the maintenance of golf courses. Stephen worked mainly in Western Pennsylvania and in some parts of Maryland, while Mike worked in New Jersey, but did sometimes end up working near St. Michael's and was familiar with Harbortown Golf Course. It was actually through Mike's familiarity with Harbortown that Stephen and Kimberly would come to be there that weekend. Stephen had, been talking with Mike about their marriage and trying to, reconcile with some things in their marriage to, spend more time together. Mike knew about the events that they would be having there and actually, used some of the people that he knew to get Stephen and Kimberly one of the nicer rooms at Harbortown. Kimberly's job as a certified surgical technician meant that she worked in the operating room and had a number of different duties, with some of them being working with the medicine that did not get used while the operation was going on. So if there was extra medicine left over, she would get rid of it. After about 9 years of marriage, though, things were starting to get a little stale, and Kimberly, around November of 97, really started making this known. A former neighbor, a woman named Teresa Armstrong, said that Kimberly once said to her, and she was paraphrasing here, that basically he didn't do anything around the house, that Kimberly had to do everything, and also that there had been a lot of verbal abuse. Now, where I mentioned, I'll bring up some things that sometimes are contradicted or how some people view this. I have seen it said that Mike was a house husband, but in most of the things I've read about, it seems like he may not have had a conventional 9-to-5 job, or he may not have been, at the house all the time. He may have had to travel at times, but he did have a job working with the golf courses. It may have been that during off seasons he didn't work quite as much, but I didn't really see him as a house husband, as was mentioned in some articles I've read. There was another woman named Norma Waltz. She was a co-worker of Kimberly, and Norma said that she had had a bad feeling about the marriage for a while, But then also, Kimberly said that she and Steve had been having problems. She relayed this on to Norma. Now, Kimberly did tell her as well that she had asked Stephen to go to counseling during the summer of 97, and this didn't seem to happen then, but we'll revisit that in a little while. Now, this type of conversation was kind of reiterated through a whole number of different witnesses, whether they were neighbors, coworkers, or friends. She was also not shy about mentioning that she was thinking about getting a divorce. So, would just kind of a stale marriage lead to divorce or even murder? That's where things start to progress a little bit more in the latter part of November 97. Kim was to be the matron of honor for a friend of hers named Jen Gowan. Now, on November 29th, that was going to be the day of the wedding. But in the prior week, which was the week of Thanksgiving, there were a lot of festivities going on. So the weekend prior, there was kind of a bachelorette party, I guess you would say traveling or progressive bachelorette party, that started first at the Miller home in Easton. Now, I kind of want to set up kind of locations here. Kimberly and Stephen lived in Laurel, Maryland. So that was on the western shore. So that was across the bay. But they were over on the eastern shore quite a bit, and that's where the case's events took place. So on the weekend prior to the wedding that Kimberly was supposed to be in, it did start in Easton, Maryland, on the eastern shore. When their whole evening was done during that bachelorette party, it ended around 1:30 a.m., so they were out pretty late. The following week, in between the bachelorette party and the wedding, there was a wedding shower that was given at Stephen and Kimberly's home in Laurel. With it being so close to Thanksgiving, with many people having off, a lot of the bridal party stayed at Stephen and Kimberly's for Thanksgiving Day. So with all of the things going on that week, there did become something very noticeable, and that was the arrival of a young man named Brad Winkler. He was the bride's cousin, and he was 10 years younger than Kimberly, being 23 years old. He was a Marine and was assigned to the Pentagon. Now, even though he was much younger than Kimberly, she really took a shine to him, and it seems he did as well. And this happened pretty quickly. He was on hand for many of the events leading up to his cousin's wedding, and Kimberly took the opportunity to spend that time with him and would sometimes find ways to speak to him in private. Someone even said that Brad seemed like he was ever present at these events. Norma Waltz would later testify that when first observing Kimberly and Brad, she thought that Kimberly was just trying to be a good listener, as even at the young age of 23, Brad already had a bad marriage behind him, and Kimberly just seemed like she was being very empathetic and lending an ear to him. However, he did kind of stick out at many of these events because, except for the ones at the Hricko house, he was the only male, and even the ones held at Kim and Stephen's home, he was the only other male other than Stephen. So Stephen did take notice of this as well, seeing that Brad and Kim were spending time together and having these private conversations, and it seemed like he was starting to be a little jealous. Now, in something I find a little odd as far as saying, maybe it's looking at it 27 years down the road, but in a conversation that Kim had with Norma, she said that Stephen was probably jealous because Brad was hitting it off with their 9-year-old daughter. So to me, I just kind of find that kind of creepy, or I don't know. That seems kind of an odd thing to say, in my opinion, because I wouldn't consider that jealousy. If that was the case, I would consider that just being a cautious father, and that you have this 23-year-old man, quote unquote, hitting it off with your 9-year-old. But things didn't end after the wedding. Brad was supposed to house sit as well as babysit for the newlyweds' 1-year-old daughter, or child. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it was a son or a daughter, but they did have a 1-year-old. And so Kim actually went over to Jen's house on a daily basis to help Brad out with the house sitting duties and babysitting duties. While Kim was going over there, eventually the relationship became a physical relationship. And even after Jen and her new husband came back from their honeymoon, they would go to Brad's aunt's house, which is where he was staying. And I don't know if the aunt was there all of the time, but that's where they would also have physical relations. Now, to kind of emphasize just how quickly this relationship came about, Kimberly actually would call Jen on her honeymoon and talk about the relationship and kind of intimating that it was becoming a physical relationship. I find that kind of odd to do when your friends on their honeymoon, other than maybe a quick call saying, "Hey, I hope you guys are having fun." She was actually calling to talk about an extramarital relationship that she was about to have with the bride's cousin. So she was very, very, I would say, enthralled in this brand new relationship. And she was very open about talking to people about this, even sometimes on the phone where, Stephen could have been listening. She told one of her friends, Rachel McCoy, who will be a bigger part of this case a little bit later on, but she had told Rachel that, quote, "I'm not going to marry this guy. This is just about sex," end quote. So looking at this relationship, it seems like it's not something that she would want long term. And knowing now that Stephen died, is this something that would make Kim want to kill him? As the police looked at the situation and tried to take in everything, they first wanted to start with Kim and find out why she wasn't in the room with her husband on Valentine's Day. They went over the timeline of events, and according to Kim, they arrived at Harbortown around 3 p.m. The dinner and murder mystery theater was due to begin around 7 p.m., so maybe just a little foreboding, but the name of the production was The Bride Who Cried. Now, Kim said that they had left dinner around 10 or 10:30 and went back to their rooms, not before buying a few beers to take back with them, though. So what was Kim doing between, let's say, 10:30 and 1:20 a.m.? That's the time between when they got back to the room and when she entered the lobby to see Elaine Phillips and Philip Parker. According to Kim, she said that she and her husband had had an agreement before they left for the weekend that there would be no intimacy for the whole weekend. However, once they got back to the room, Steve started pressuring her and she got upset and decided to leave. She at first decided to go visit the Millers, but got lost. Now, the Millers live in Easton, which can take about 15 minutes, give or take, from St. Michael's. So even if you count in traveling time at the longest, travel time should have been around 45 minutes. That meant that she would have been lost for well over an hour, and this is giving her the benefit of the doubt as to what time exactly she left. At a minimum, if she had been gone for 2 hours, she would have had well over an hour of time that she was lost. So she said she kept driving around, and the police found this odd because once they did speak with the Millers, they found out that she'd driven there recently, so she did know the area. To add to that, though, Kim's brother, Michael Wolf, who I'll just refer to as her brother since we already have a Michael in the case, he only lived a couple of blocks away from the Millers, so she should have known that area quite well. So even if she didn't drive it from, say her house or St. Michael's to the Millers that often, she would have at least known her brother and where he lived. The next question they had, which also is backed up by Maureen, doesn't make a lot of sense. The police did ask, why didn't you just call? Try to get the directions. By this time, Maureen and Mike had been called. They'd made their way to the golf course. They were sitting with Kimberly, and Maureen even had the same question, why didn't you call? And what she told Maureen was, I can say vague, but vague doesn't even seem to fit the answer that she gave. When she asked, why didn't you just call us? She said that she didn't want to wake them up. And of course, astutely, the police were thinking, if you didn't want to wake them up with a phone call, why were you going to visit them? Makes sense, right? That would be your next question. Also, to whoever Kim spoke to that morning. As the morning progressed, more people came to examine the scene. Some of her friends or family came to support her. She told everyone that she could that Stephen was drunk. She used terms such as he drank a lot, sloppy drunk, fairly drunk, making it seem like he had drunk a ton of alcohol. She also said that he drank a whole bottle of champagne, but she said he also did this while at the dinner theater. So there would have been witnesses to see exactly how drunk he was, kind of setting a scene for, did he accidentally do something to set the room on fire? Was it his fault, by accident that the room caught fire? The problem with this was, and what Kimberly had absolutely no way of knowing, is that by chance, sitting at her table was one of the Talbot County Assistant State's Attorneys. So even though he had no idea he would end up being a witness to the precursor to a murder that night, he could say honestly that he did not see them drink any more than one beer. So following up with the bartender said just in general that whole table didn't drink that much. And the police went even further and pulled the bar tab for Kimberly and Stephen, and the total was $5.51. Even in 1998, that was not a large bar bill. That would be the equivalent of 2 beers. So frankly, Stephen did not have a lot of alcohol in his system, or could not have had a lot of alcohol in his system. And that is exactly what happened when the toxicology report came back. It found that Stephen had exactly 0.0 blood alcohol content. So nothing in his system, which also means that there was enough time for that alcohol from that one beer to get out of his system before he died. Now, Kim, being a surgical technician, and while not exactly dealing with the actual operation and things like that, this is something you'd think that she would know, and instead of kind of setting up the whole sloppy drunk, as she said, it actually went against her in that her direct statements to the police now were refuted. They had absolute evidence that he did not have a high BAC at all. Now, Trooper Elsie was the police officer who dealt more directly with Kim. So she did a follow-up interview on the 23rd after the toxicology was back, and, Kim went on with her usual, he was a sloppy drunk, he drank a lot, drank a bottle of champagne, and Trooper Elsie said, we have the BAC report. He has 0 alcohol in his system, and all that she could say was that she didn't understand. She just kept saying that she didn't understand. She further went on and asked about, why didn't you try to get help near the cottage? And she said that she actually was trying to wake people up, but nobody would wake up in the cottages. That also seems very unusual in that there were 5 other rooms, and while some people might be heavy sleepers, the fact that all of them would not wake up, especially if she was yelling something like fire, that did not make sense either. If you're in a small room and you hear someone yelling that there's a fire, you're going to get up and check. But none of that checked out as well. While the police questioned people who were involved in Kim's life, a man came forward with some information that really brought Kim into focus as a possible suspect, even more so than she had already been looked at. And this is one of the things that the supporters that Kim has will point to as not being like good solid evidence. This gentleman's name was Kenneth Burgess. I'm thinking it's probably pronounced Burgess. But he came forward to say that he was a co-worker of Kim. He was also a surgical tech at the hospital. And he had been convicted more than a decade earlier of welfare fraud. So at one point, Kim approached him. He had been leaning against the wall, I guess between surgeries, doing something, but his back was towards her. So she approached him from behind, possibly knowing about his history of having a fraud in his name. But she said from behind, "Ken, I want to talk to you." And so he had previously just been standing there, but he turned around to talk to her, and Kim said to him that she wanted to kill Stephen. So he just kind of took it as a joke because, seriously, who would just come up to someone and say that even before he had a chance to completely turn around? So, like I'm sure most people would say, he was like, nope, I am not getting involved in this. Even if he does have a welfare fraud against him, that was more than a decade prior, and it's a far cry from killing someone. So he actually tried to talk her out of doing anything, like that. And she actually went as far as to offer him $50,000. Now, some places will say $5,000 because they said he didn't remember, but I mostly saw $50,000 listed. But Kenneth was adamant he was not going to get involved in anything that pertained to murder. And so she just asked him to forget the conversation. But Ken said something and he probably later regretted it. Just kind of as a off-the-cuff remark, he said something to the effect of, well, you work in an operating room and, the medicines can put him to sleep. And probably he was looking back at that and kind of regretting those words right there. And that is something that was very important once other testimony came forward. Now, I did mention the $50,000, and you may wonder where she would come up with that money. And the first thought would be life insurance. So, just briefly talking about the life insurance, in one of the articles where the supporters are saying it was only $200,000, which would be about $387,000 today, and she would be giving about a quarter of that towards someone to kill Stephen. What is not always mentioned is that there was another policy once the police looked around, and that was $450,000 total between the two policies. And that would be worth over $871,000 today. So that's a big difference. If $50,000 was offered and it was only a $200,000 life insurance, that's one quarter. Whereas if you're looking at $450,000, that's about 1/9 or around 11%. So that changes things a bit. In looking at the testimony of Jen Gowan, that was Brad's cousin and who had been the bride earlier, she was very forward in discussing the relationship that she had with Brad, which, as Brad's cousin, I wonder if that was quite a bit uncomfortable. But she had confided that, prior to the events of Valentine's weekend, that she and Stephen had only been intimate once in, the past prior few months, and became very forward and frank in describing the relationship she was having with Brad. But even more forward were her discussions in what she would do to get rid of Stephen. She would tell Jen that she thought about killing Stephen because the hurdle about getting a divorce that we see in a lot of divorce situations is custody of their child. And that's what Kimberly was afraid of, according to testimony given by some of her friends and coworkers. She thought that in the course of a divorce, Stephen might be able to turn their daughter against Kim. And what was even worse, in my opinion, is she almost seemed to frame the death of Stephen as a mercy killing, saying that without her and their daughter, that Stephen would be nothing, that he would be better off dead without her and their daughter. And, it seems very, very harsh, and that Kim was very self-centered in these things, very egotistical. This is my opinion. She was just very egotistical in these things. And it was a very interesting way of looking at things, I must say. She also was worried about, she said, if she told Stephen about Brad and they got a divorce, it might make Stephen depressed. So in other words, again, kind of setting up some ideas. Would he get depressed if he knew about the affair? And also, again, that whole hint of he would be better off dead, which that still amazes me. But she was worried about if he did get depressed and kill himself. She did express worry about getting the life insurance because they may not be able to collect it if he did kill himself. Now, this is where things get very interesting in terms of how concretely do we know that Kim knew how to kill Stephen. And that's with something called succinylcholine, or SUX, You may have heard that before, and it's used in anesthesiology to relax the muscles. It is the strongest muscle relaxant, probably, that there is, in my opinion, because it's used so that the patient doesn't, start moving during surgery. But from what I've heard, it's an absolutely horrible way to die. And thinking about this and knowing that there was a fire in the room as well just makes it even more horrible to think about. But it relaxes everything so completely that eventually you suffocate. And this would be adding a fire on top of that, and the fear that anybody who was under that would have is unimaginable. But the thing is, it's undetectable, especially on just a regular toxicology screening. But Kim did know that. She had mentioned that it would not be able to be seen in a toxicology report. And she had these conversations with people with this, with one particular conversation being with Jen, and expressing to Jen that no matter what, her brother would always support her, even if she killed someone. And in a very forceful comment, one of the things that Jen said that Kim told her was that, quote, "If I could kill Steve and get away with it, I would do it tomorrow," end quote. Going back more into the history of the conversations and what Kim may have been planning on doing, she seemed to be getting more frantic as time went by. On January 30th, she called her friend Rachel, but Rachel had gone out with some other people for dinner and wasn't home. And remember, this was 1998, so not everybody had cell phones. In fact, Rachel had an answering machine, so not even voicemail. But once she got home around 11 or 11:30, she saw that there were a lot of messages from Kim, and they were progressively getting more and more frantic. And so she called her back, and Kim was saying that she needed to talk to her right then. And hearing the panic in Kim's voice, Rachel was like, "Yes, just give me 15 minutes." And then she was on her way. Once Rachel got there, it appeared to her that Kimberly had been drinking, and that was kind of fueling her emotions and how upset she was. Kim told her that she, quote, "had a plan on how to do it where she wouldn't get caught," end quote. So she further explained to Rachel that she could get her hands on a drug that would paralyze her husband. She also described how it would stop his breathing, and then she would set the curtains on fire with a candle or cigar. That way he would die of smoke inhalation. And this is where something important comes in. There was a cigar found with Stephen that night. There was a pack that had one missing, backwoods cigars, and the medical examiner, he ran a whole slew of tests where he tested it against the pillow, and it kept falling off the pillow. So if Stephen had been laying in between the beds, which is where he was, that it would have rolled off the pillow. He tested it in every way imaginable to see if that cigar would cause the pillow to set on fire. He even tried it without a pillowcase on it, and yes, there was some soot and damage like that to it, but nothing that could indicate it would start a fire. He even tried it on the bedspread. And there are pictures, especially one picture in one of the articles that will be listed. That was an intense fire. It was not just like a smoldering fire that slowly, was just kind of hanging around or lingering. No, it was an intense fire. So the medical examiner did everything he could to make that cigar light something ablaze, and it did not do it. Now, additionally, because she mentioned the cigar here to Rachel, they asked all of Stephen's friends, relatives, if Stephen smoked, because according to Kim, he smoked when he drank. But not one person would testify that Stephen ever smoked. There were even people that he worked with where there was some type of event at work and they were all offered high-end, top-notch cigars that he refused. So, it was her word against dozens of other people to say that Stephen did not smoke a cigar at any time. So going back to that night with Rachel, as she's continuing to detail things, that might happen, and in kind of a precursor to things that may have happened, Rachel, of course, was trying to talk Kim out of any of these things. At this point, the retreat to St. Michael's hadn't been planned yet, But Rachel tried to point out the dangers to the plan and the fact that she probably would not get away with it. And one of those things was pointing out that if she started a fire, it would possibly spread to the whole house and burn it down, and also to her neighbors. So Rachel did, hear exactly what Kim said she was going to do. And remember, Rachel is Kim's friend. This is not a casual acquaintance to be given testimony. This is someone that Kim called when she thought that she needed somebody. And Rachel is telling this information to the police and later at court during the trial. So on that same night at around 1:30, Kim said she needed to use the bathroom. Rachel waited a while and then decided she wanted to go up and check on her because it had been quite a few minutes. What she found there was even more surprising. She didn't know that Stephen was home, frankly, because Kim is sitting in the living room talking all about how she's going to kill Stephen. You would think that she's going to be talking about this when Stephen's not around and maybe he's away for business. But no, Stephen was actually asleep. And when Rachel found Kimberly, she was standing kind of across the room staring down at him. And this is how she described it, that Kimberly was, quote, standing there, staring on the other side, staring at him with her arms down at her sides, just standing there. And I just told her to come back downstairs, end quote. Kimberly was crying, and it took some time for Rachel to calm her down and get her to stop crying. And Rachel told her that she just needed to go to sleep, maybe calm down for a while. And Rachel stayed for a little while until 2 a.m. And she stayed in contact with Kimberly the following day, calling her early in the morning to check on things. And that was the last time Rachel spoke with Kim before that Valentine's Day weekend. So you may wonder then if the timeline of Stephen's death may have changed a little bit because Rachel had been there to talk to Kim and to maybe stop her from doing anything that night or a subsequent night. But during that approximate 2 weeks, there seemed to have been a mutual understanding that happened in the marriage. Outwardly, it seemed that they had both decided that they wanted to work on their marriage to somehow get through this tough time. And looking at it, people could see that Stephen was really trying to make it work. And in my opinion, in some ways, Kim mocked Stephen for this. When talking to Teresa Armstrong, she said that Stephen was going to counseling and trying to work on the marriage. She had asked Stephen for a divorce in January, and it sounds like he genuinely was trying. He even wrote a letter to his wife, and though I don't have a full transcript of that letter, she had read it to Teresa over the phone. But in that same conversation, she told Teresa that he, quote, made her sick to her stomach, end quote. In other conversations, when she had been talking to Rachel before, she had talked about how all he did was want to talk to her all the time and that he was driving her crazy. So it wasn't like Kim was really taking it seriously, not as seriously as Stephen, and even found Stephen to be annoying in some ways. She said that Stephen had begged for another chance and cried. He canceled some of his work trips, which again, this is where when I hear some people say that he was a stay-at-home husband, he had business trips. In some factions or in some groups, it's made to look like Stephen didn't do anything, that he didn't work outside the home, but he did, at least in most of the transcripts from the court and also from other articles. He did definitely work. It wasn't as though Kim was the only one working in the household. But he did cancel some of those trips to try to spend more time with her. He had gotten appointments with a counselor, but Kim said that he was smothering her and following her around the house like a puppy. He also was working on a journal. In one entry, he said, quote, life at home is improving and I'm looking forward to Valentine's weekend at Harbortown with Kim. She called twice today and said I love you without my saying it first. I was very happy. Kim and I have not made love yet, and I want to, but it will wait as long as it takes. I love her. I believe I know what being in love really is. We have been married 9 years, but I feel like we just started dating. And that is heartbreaking to me. Now, if we wanted more proof that Kim was not taking this seriously, that same Valentine's Day weekend on February 13th, She went to visit Brad at his aunt's house. Since she was going to be away on the 14th, she now knew that. Stephen had told her about the getaway. Brad was working at the Pentagon, but she got into the home and she left presents for him in his room. And the note said, quote, "Brad, I really wanted to give you all these gifts in person, but I guess the Pentagon had a different idea. I am so proud of what you do, so I'll just go on missing you. Have a nice weekend at home, baby. I look forward to seeing you soon. Happy Valentine's Day, sir. I love you so very much. Hugs and kisses, Kim." End quote. Now, after the murder, of course, her friends were probably in a mix of wanting to be supportive, but also thinking about all the things she had said in the past. And at some point, some of her friends and coworkers had had a chance to talk to each other. So when Teresa Armstrong was speaking with Kimberly, she asked, quote, "Did you tell Rachel exactly what you were going to do?" End quote. And the response that Kimberly gave was just yes. So she admitted that. During another conversation, Teresa asked her how she felt about what happened in Harbortown the weekend of Valentine's Day, and Kimberly said that she was feeling a lot of remorse. Remorse indicates that you've done something wrong. And Jen herself also visited Kim in jail once she was arrested. I do just want to take a stop here to also go over one other piece of evidence, and that was carbon monoxide. We know that if there's a fire, there's going to be carbon monoxide in the lungs. In this case, he was actually dead before the fire was started, or at least until it took, a good hold onto the room, because there was no carbon monoxide in his lungs. So he was dead when the fire actually started or became overwhelming. And I guess in some ways, at least he didn't have that fear of that fire. But it was so concentrated on the upper part of his body. Like, how did that happen? I know I went over the cigar and that was tested. One other thing they looked at was the log that had been in the fireplace. Now, it was a type of store-bought log, and this is where some of Kim's supporters look at it and say, well, this type of log technically is not supposed to be used in a fireplace like that, and that was true. But there were, again, tests on if an ember or something could fly across the room and set a fire to that extent, and those tests did not show that that was possible. And again, if you do see the pictures in the one of the articles of the room, again, it had to be a very strong fire, and there was no way that the medical examiner and anybody in forensics could make that happen. They even went to testing sites that they use for this type of thing, getting the pillow and pillowcase from Harbortown so that it was the exact same type, and they could not get a fire to start that way. And so Trooper Elsie did bring this up to Kim, and again, Kim just said that she didn't understand. So this is really a point where there was no doubt that something odd happened. It was not just an accident. And so there was a time when Trooper Elsie really thought that possibly Kim might confess. And this was when Kimberly said to Trooper Elsie that she would tell her what had happened, but she wanted to see her daughter first. And then she actually asked or said, quote, "I really want to tell you the truth, but can I still go home?" End quote. And in the trial, all of the testimony and conversations that she had that I've previously gone through were given as evidence in trial, including testimony about the log with the carbon monoxide, testing the cigar, everything like that. However, when there was an appeal, this is where there was, I guess you would say, some gray areas, because the way Kim was looking at things was as individual separate items. Just the fire was a fire and the death was a death. And instead of looking at the whole mountain, I guess you would say, of evidence, she wanted them looked at separately. Now, the judge actually ruled against the prosecution in that the fire marshal could not testify that he thought it was arson. What he could testify to was that he tried all of these other tests and exactly what he did with those tests, and those did not start the fire. It would then be inferred, most likely, though, by the jury that if nothing natural in that room caused the fire, that it had to be set. And since Stephen's body was burned, there you couldn't really trace the sucks, that there was no proof that there was murder. However, if you take the whole list of evidence, the numerous times she talked to people about killing Stephen, the way that she kind of approached everything the night of the murder, and then you take it together that what are the odds that someone's going to accidentally die before a fire starts? The first time that he ever smokes a cigar, because again, everybody said he never smoked a cigar, yet somehow something that they can't figure out started a fire in that room that did not spread anywhere else either, but just burned the upper part of Stephen's body. Looking at all of that, even though it's circumstantial, even though you could not actually see the injection mark of the succinylcholine or sucks, the argument was it was in the part of his body that was burned. And looking through all of that, the jury did come back with a guilty verdict, and she was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years for the arson. So while most people understand and think that Kim did definitely kill her husband, based on the fact that a lot of the testimony, if not the vast majority of it, came from her friends and her co-workers, not just Stephen's, it really is probably the strongest circumstantial evidence case that I've ever seen. You know, if someone can sit there and tell another person that they're going to use a paralyzing agent so that their spouse suffocates, and then their husband suffocates with no other, mode of death that they can see, then you told another or that person you're going to set the curtains on fire, and there's a fire, plus you mentioned a cigar that your husband doesn't even smoke, and there was a cigar, that right there is, to me at least, beyond reasonable doubt. So as I said, there's still people who support Kim, and I do understand about the log, having been tested and everything, that the log in the fire is not supposed to be used in a fireplace. But considering all of the testing that went on, it's hard to believe that just coincidentally that happened in that room only and not in any of the other rooms that may have had a fireplace. So what do you think? Do you think that Kim is innocent, or do you think that the evidence of her telling Rachel exactly what was going to happen, the only difference was the locale, of her offering to give somebody money to kill him, and also then mentioning to other people about how Stephen would be better off dead if they were divorced? And that, to me, is beyond all reasonable doubt. Now, looking at what Kim has done since then, it does seem like she has tried to turn her life around in prison. She does try to help out others, and she has a big heart while in prison in helping others, but that doesn't mean she shouldn't pay for what she has been convicted of doing. If she has turned her life around truly, then I'm happy that she can contribute to those around her and help others around her, but it doesn't stop the fact that Stephen's parents, I know he had at least one sister, they lost their loved one. His friends lost a loved one. And, there's no getting back from that. It was a purposeful action, and she has to pay for that. So with that, I'm going to end today's episode. Somewhere in the middle of the episode, my microphone started acting a little wonky, I guess, is the best way to say it, and the volume was going up and down. I'll do my best to try to fix that. And like I said, I'll give updates on, what I might have to do to make sure that the podcast still has a home or a platform to host it. Thank you all for listening. I know it's been a while, but I will talk to you all soon, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the weekend, and I hope if you are from Delmarva that we do not, or anywhere affected by this, that we do not get the snow that they're expecting this week, because I do not do well in snow or cold. So be safe, everyone, and thanks again. Bye-bye.